I mentioned before that when I was in school, I was in a Catholic school for 12 years, during which time I was very interested in the Catholic religion. And then after that, I left religion for a few years. And then when I graduated in 1971, I had a friend who was very interested in Hinduism, a Chinese, Malaysian Chinese. And because of his influence, I got into Hinduism from 1971 onwards until, you could say, until I met Buddhism in 1976. And during that span of like 5 years, I wrote to India for books like Ramakrishna Mark, and I wrote to other Hindu organizations for these teachings of these great Hindu masters. And then I also corresponded with this Self-Realization Fellowship, Yogananda, and I got books from them. So I had already been practicing meditation and learning the Upanishads, Vedanta and all that, which were quite similar to Buddhist teachings. So when I came into the Buddha's teachings, I found that it was much better explained, much more detailed. The Buddha's words in the suttas are very, very detailed and very precise. Mainly because he's a Samnak Sambodhi Buddha, unlike some of these Hindu saints. Some of these Hindu saints could well have been Pachika Buddhas, but they didn't. They certainly, some of them could have been enlightened, but the way they explained were not so detailed as the Buddha. So when we go into the suttas, we find it's full of practical advice, from simple things like for a monk to learn to be contented, to have few wants, and to live in secluded places, or when you live with monks, to live with monks who have experience, who are well learned in the Dhamma Vinaya, the suttas and the Vinaya. So many of these suttas, when we study it for the first time, we find that we catch 1 or 2 points. And then when we study it for the second time, we catch another 1 or 2 points. And sometimes very important points we miss out until we have learned it studied the sutta several times. Then we catch the important implication. Even a simple sutta where the Buddha said that a monk should not chant in a high sing-song manner like Mahayana monks do. And he said that if you do that, if a monk chants in a sing-song manner, then he becomes distracted by it, and then he thinks that he's got a very high, a very beautiful voice, and he becomes, how do you say, he thinks too much of himself. And the Buddha says it can also make the monk lose his concentration. That point, I think a lot of people don't catch. But if a monk is practicing, then you realize actually the Buddha wants his disciples to maintain the concentration the whole day. That's how a monk becomes an arahant. An arahant in the Vinaya books is supposed to be mindful 24 hours a day. Before he can come to that stage, he has already got to practice to the point of being mindful 24 hours a day. So if a person were to practice to be mindful 24 hours a day, then that is the correct practice. And actually that is the practice of Satipatthana. In the Satipatthana Sangyutta, the Buddha gave head-on, how do you say, like let's say, hitting the head with the head of the nail with the hammer. And this simile he gave was that to practice Satipatthana, he gave this simile. He said the most beautiful girl of the country came out, and the men saw, and they clapped their hands and they shouted, the most beautiful girl of the country. And more men came out and shouted. And some men clapped and asked her to sing and dance, and she started to sing and dance. And then more more people came out, and they shouted and they clapped their hands and they enjoyed her singing and dancing. And then an ordinary guy came along who wanted his life, who did not want suffering, and he was caught by these soldiers and forced to carry a bowl of oil filled to the brim. And he was told that behind him a soldier would be walking with an upraised sword, and if he spilled even a drop of the oil, his head would be chopped off. So that being so, this man had to walk amongst a crowd of people, and the Buddha asked his disciples, would he look to his right or to his left? And they said no. Would he look at the most beautiful girl of the country? Certainly not. So he has to pay attention on this bowl of oil all the time, one pointed attention. And then the Buddha, that simile the Buddha gave was to make us understand that the practice of satipatthana is actually an intense state of mindfulness or recollection that brings one to mindfulness 24 hours a day. That's why in one of these Satipatthana Sangyutta Suttas, the Buddha said a skillful monk who practices Satipatthana attains samadhi, while an unskillful monk does not attain samadhi. But unfortunately nowadays some teachers teach that Satipatthana has absolutely nothing to do with jhana, with samadhi. This is not the case in the suttas.